Welcome to the forum. I am Fred Schauer, a professor here at the Kennedy School, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening's discussion. Let me introduce the discussion briefly and our participants briefly. According to Department of Defense Directive 1332.14 of January 1982, quote, homosexuality is incompatible with military service, end quote. According to that directive, members of the military who engage in homosexual acts or by their statements demonstrate a propensity to engage in homosexual acts shall be separated from the military service. That policy replaces a somewhat less stringent policy that existed prior to 1981 that provided that there should be a balancing between the kinds of interests that I've just mentioned on the one hand, and on the other, questions about good order, discipline, morale, trust and confidence, and so on. To discuss this question tonight, we have with us four panelists. First, and I will explain shortly a little bit more detail about the content of the discussion. First, Colonel Margareta Kammermeier. Colonel Kammermeier has been, in one form or another, a member of the Army since 1961. She joined the Army Student Nurse Program in 1961. She began active duty in 1964. From 1967 until 1968, Colonel Kammermeier served in the 24th Evacuation Hospital in Vietnam and was awarded the Bronze Star. After several more years of active duty, she entered private life and also in 1972 joined the Army Reserves as a nurse. She remains a member of the Army Reserves, is now a full colonel, has been awarded numerous awards. In the context of, I should also mention, I am not sure what order colonel or doctor would go in. She is also a PhD, serves currently as the state chief nurse for the state of Washington and consultant to the state surgeon of the state of Washington. Several years ago, in the context of an investigation relating to awarding Colonel Kammermeier a top secret security clearance, she was asked about her sexual orientation. She said, in response to that, I am a lesbian. In response to that, proceedings were commenced primarily through the Department of Defense to have her terminated from the Washington Army National Guard. Those proceedings are still in progress. Next, Dr. Lawrence Corb. Dr. Corb has had a long and distinguished career in various different aspects of public and, on occasion, private life. He is currently director of the Center for Public Policy Education and senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Studies program at the Brookings Institution. He has been Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manpower Reserve Affairs, Installations, and Logistics from 1981 to 1985. He's been Dean of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Pittsburgh, a Vice President for Corporate Operations at Raytheon, a Naval Flight Officer in the United States Navy with the rank of Captain, and on and on and on. Among his many books and publications are The Joint Chiefs of Staff, The First 25 Years, and The Fall and Rise of the Pentagon. Sandra Lowe is a lawyer after serving for several years as a criminal defense lawyer. She then served for a number of years as an attorney with the Lambda Legal Defense and Education Fund. Currently is the director of the Governor's of New York Office of Gay and Lesbian Concerns. Shortly to be sitting next to her is Congressman Barney Frank, who, when asked to provide biographical information, said, among other things, he believes that lengthy recitations of a speaker's prior life are usually boring and thus does not supply much biographical information to those who will be introducing him. However, prior to entering Congress, Representative Frank, who is now in his 6th term, was a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives. Before that was administrative assistant to United States Congressman Michael Harrington and executive assistant to Mayor Kevin White of Boston. 1 or 2 minutes of legal and constitutional background. That is not to suggest that this is only a legal issue. It is not to suggest that this is only a constitutional issue. It is to suggest that it is in part a legal issue and in part a constitutional issue, and legal issues and constitutional issues are what I know a little bit about, so that's what I'll talk about. I want to start this very brief framework by noting that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States provides, nor shall any state deny to any person the equal protection of the laws. Since 1955, that provision, the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, has applied not only to the states but also to the federal government, it having been determined by the Supreme Court of the United States in a companion case to Brown versus the Board of Education that there is an equal protection component in the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment as well. In a number of cases in the 1960s and 1970s, the Equal Protection Clause, although originally intended to deal with the issue of race and the issue of slavery, has been applied to discrimination on a number of other grounds: gender, illegitimacy, alienage, that is, being a non-citizen, and some number of others. The Supreme Court, therefore, has it and has exercised the authority to extend the Equal Protection Clause to discrimination on the basis of traits other than race. It has been asked on some number of occasions, most recently and most prominently the case of Bowers versus Hardwick, to include within those suspect classifications discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Despite, therefore, the fact that it has exercised the authority on numerous occasions to apply the Equal Protection Clause to issues other than race, it has consistently refused to apply it to issues of sexual orientation. The fact that the Supreme Court has refused to do so does not suggest that Congress, were it of a mind to do so, could not treat discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation as unlawful, even though under current Supreme Court interpretations it is not unconstitutional. Two quite prominent examples of Congress having done just that are the question of discrimination on the basis of age, which is not under current interpretation unconstitutional, but is a violation of federal law, and so in some number of contexts, including voting, discrimination on the basis of not being a speaker of the English language. Therefore, it is within Congress's constitutional power to enact a statute outlawing generally or outlawing with respect to something within its province, including the military, discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. It has not done so. Despite the fact that Congress has not done so, just as Congress is permitted to do what the Supreme Court has not yet done directly, so too are some number of agencies permitted to do what Congress may not have required them to do. That is, despite what I have just said about Congress, some number of federal agencies could, if they were of a mind to, eliminate discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. One of those agencies that in most respects could, if it wanted to, outlaw or end discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation within its province is the Department of Defense. It has, as of this evening, not done so. The United States Coast Guard, which operates under the Department of the Treasury and not the Department of Defense, has in a very small way begun to move to lessen the import of its parallel provision to the DoD regulation that I mentioned earlier. Other than that, the military has not done so. Our speakers tonight will address that issue, and we will start with Colonel Powell.
Well, thank you for coming. It's cold here. I come from Seattle. It was nice and warm and no snow, no rain. So I have had to go through some adjustment in the temperature, too. I hardly need to really say much about my military career, but I'd like to put it a little bit into context so that you can sort of see where I started and where I am today. I will say that as of this evening, I was also still in the military, and I don't know if I will be when I get home. I joined the Army Student Nurse Program in 1961, and after completing my degree, ended up serving in the military. The requirement at that time was that you serve 3 years, and then you could do whatever you wanted to. I completed my tour, and in those days you couldn't initially, I mean, this is the dark ages, you couldn't initially be a woman and in the military and be married. They found that that was not a very smart thing to do if they wanted women in the military, and that was also a questionable decision that they were debating at the time. And so the regulation was changed, and I met my husband in the military while we were stationed in Germany. And then upon our return from Germany, he ended up getting orders for Vietnam, and I, like a good, dutiful wife, said or requested to be sent also. And the military said, not a problem. And so in 1967, I was sent to Vietnam, and his orders were canceled, and he stayed home. Because of the buildup there, it didn't take long before he was part of a new unit that was then activated, and he too went to Vietnam. I extended over there so that we could come back together. And so we came back in 1968, and in those days, as a woman in the military, it shows that it can make changes. I still believe that as a woman in the military, you could not have dependents under 16, and there was no one that I knew who could deliver a 16-year-old. So we were starting our family, and so I was at that time discharged from the military, and this was in 1968, and stayed out until the regulation was changed again. And so in 1972, I went back into the military, only this time as an Army reservist, and stayed in the Army Reserves for a total of 15 years, and had 3 more sons, so I have a total of four sons. And then in 1980 decided that I probably should not be married. And so I became not married, and stayed in the military, and then did some moving of jobs and that sort of thing. But eventually where things are now is that I transferred to the National Guard in 1987 and have been the state chief nurse of the Washington National Guard since that time. We've sort of mobilized a hospital and, done things that armies do. And while I was finishing my doctorate and having had sort of a lifelong belief that maybe I had something to offer the military, I wanted to try to get myself into a competitive position to be Chief of the Corps. Am I 10 minutes up yet?
No, not even close. Not even close.
We've been told how long we're allowed to talk, and sometimes, we all ramble. But you went beyond the 2 minutes.
That's right. The excess that I took comes out of your time. No. No.
You can have Barney Frank style.
Right.
So finishing my doctorate, then I decided that I really still wanted to be in a position of being able to influence change in the military, and was trying to get myself in position to go to the War College and to apply for the position of Chief Nurse of the National Guard. To do that, I needed a top-secret security clearance and requested that those paperwork be initiated. That was in January of 1989. And in the course of the investigation or my interrogation that took place in May of 1989, when asked about my sexual orientation, for the first time since I had been in the military, that question was asked, and I told them that I was a lesbian. Well, needless to say, the interrogation continued for a while longer. And what was going to be a 45-minute interrogation turned out to be about 5 hours worth. I was pretty naive. I was sure that the military in its wisdom would see that I had been a good soldier for 23 years at that time, and that because I had already told them that I was a lesbian, certainly there was nothing to blackmail me for, because they already knew. And so I at the same time had a sinking feeling that my career was probably over. And in the course of the next 6 months, then I sort of waited for something to happen. And I had called the ACLU just in the event I was going to need a little help in the state of Washington. And they said, well, you know, we're just finishing up dealing with the Perry Watkins case. We probably don't need to take on anything else right now. And so they threw away my name. And I felt pretty alone and pretty vulnerable. And through some peculiar circumstances, ended up with the name and address and phone number of an organization in New York called Lambda Legal Defense and Education Fund. And the very first person that I spoke with who was there and heard my cries for help, if you will, was Sandy Lou, who, you know, was probably my greatest support during the next few months when I couldn't say anything to anybody, and I didn't know what was going to be happening with regard to the military. And every time I turned around, I could call Sandy, and she was there to just sort of let me know that when the military decided to move, that Lambda would be there. And they certainly have been. The state of Washington and the National Guard decided that they would not take any action in my case and refused to begin administrative proceedings for my discharge based on my own statement. The Department of Army then mandated that my commander, who wanted me to stay and do my job as state chief nurse, was told that he would need to initiate administrative proceedings, which he did. And being the meticulous surgeon that he is, took about 2.5 years for things can move in, you know, you don't want to make any mistakes when you know, there was the clue that, you know, as someone who had been in the military for over 20 years, I had my 20-year letter and I could retire, and I wasn't. They became a little suspect that perhaps there was a second agenda. And after a while, there certainly was. You know, my career is over. However, the situation has not changed, and that regulation still stands, and it has to change. And so I guess my cause in some ways has become trying to be a spokesperson for the gays that are still in the military and could not come out. In June or July of this past year of 1991, they held an administrative board at which Dr. Corb was kind enough to fly out and testify on my behalf. But because the regulation is the way it is, the board felt that they could do nothing but recommend my honorable discharge. And in the event that the DOD regulation were changed, that my case be reconsidered. That was in July. In October, the Defense Investigative Services came back to investigate to see whether or not I should have a top secret security clearance. And this assured me that this really had nothing to do with the previous case, and that I should just go ahead and talk to them some more. And we gave them, this time I went with my attorney, my military attorney, and we gave them copies of the transcripts from the hearing and that sort of thing. You know, we've had a war, we've won the war, in quotes, and I could have had a baby in the time that the military is still trying to decide whether or not to follow their own regulation on discharging me, because I'm still in the National Guard, and I'm beginning to, feel a bit of a squeeze, but feel that, as long as I can be vocal and wear the uniform and do my job, that perhaps I can demonstrate that sexual orientation has nothing to do with anyone's ability to serve their country. Thank you.
Greta's a tough act to follow in more ways than one. I got this letter to come up here, and I was asked to come up and explain why the military has the policy that they do. And I told people who called me, you ought to get somebody from the Pentagon. I don't work there anymore, and I just think that the policy is wrong, but nobody would come up. And I think that tells you something. One of the things that it tells me, because this is not the first forum that I've been involved in, I was on Nightline about 1.5 years ago discussing this question, is that nobody from the Department of Defense will come forward, because I don't think that they know in their heart of hearts that they really can defend it in any logical way. Now, that doesn't mean it will change, because change in the Department of Defense usually has to come from the outside. I think if you asked many military people, what their ideal force would be, they would like to have single, white, heterosexual males. That would be their ideal force. It's sort of a from here to eternity military is the idea that they would like to have. And if you look at each of those categories, you will see that change in each of those areas has had to come from the outside. If you go back and read the studies and documents that people put out prior to World War II, when a very practical question confronted the armed forces of the United States, we were a country much smaller than we are now. We were going to raise an armed force, which during World War II, 16 million people were brought into the armed forces. And so a very practical question was raised, well, if you don't take in minorities, how are you going to fight this war? And if you read the documents and the studies at that particular time, you'll find that the services, particularly the Navy, said, well, we just couldn't do it because, whites do not want to fill in the blank with blacks. They don't want to eat with them. They don't want to shower with them. They don't want to take orders from them. And interestingly enough, the blacks that did fight and fight quite heroically in World War II, as they have in all wars, fought in separate units. It wasn't until after World War II in 1948 that President Truman, with an executive order, desegregated the armed services. But it didn't happen overnight. The Army, which has been in the forefront of this, sort of dragged their heels. Colonel Kammermeyer, your boss, is wonderful if you agree with what the bureaucracy is trying to do. If you don't, it's kind of be frustrating as they take their time doing things. The Army dragged its heels and really doesn't begin integrating until after the Korean War. It takes the Navy a full 30 years to actually integrate the service. Admiral Zumwalt, who was the chief of naval operations, who came in 1970 and was there till 1974, was the first admiral really to try and integrate the Navy. And because of resistance from his subordinate commanders, we actually ended up with race riots on the ships in the Tonkin Gulf during the war in Vietnam. Similarly, if you take a look at the question of admitting females to significant roles in the military, you'll see again it came from the outside. Congress in the late 60s changed the law that limited the percentage of women in the military to 2% and basically limited them to medical and administrative jobs. And then the politicians who wanted to go to a volunteer military in the 70s recognized that it would be very hard to get enough people, given the anti-military attitude that existed in this country in the 70s, without, in fact, opening up the ranks and the jobs to women. Now, when I was in the Pentagon and we pushed the military to open up more jobs, we were told, well, women, you know, they'll never be able to do well in combat, and if we go to war and women get killed and captured, the country will call off the war, and so we can't let them do that. Well, we went to war, women were captured and killed, and we did very well in the war, and I might add that we had a higher percentage of women and minorities than we ever had in the service, and we did very, very well in this war. But even when the war was over, the military did not open up the combat ranks to women. The Congress had to pass a law opening up the pilots or fighter and bomber pilots to women, and even then the Pentagon has not implemented it. In the tried and true tradition of bureaucracies, they set up a commission to study this, which will take at least a year. One of the members said, oh, we couldn't possibly get this done in a year. And similarly, if you take a look at the question of people being married, they didn't want to allow people to live off base. They didn't want to allow dependents to go overseas. And you saw during the Gulf War, they refused to make accommodations to single parents and people who were people in the service who were married to other members of the service. Parenthetically, I might point out, when I came into the Pentagon, one of the most interesting things happened. The service chiefs came to me and said, we got a terrible problem with all these women and their single parents, and we need to do something. So I said, well, let's find out, get some information. We found out that we did have a big problem with single parents, 3/4 of whom were men. And that, in fact, we did need a policy to ensure that, given the fact that marriages no longer last as long as they did and the courts no longer automatically award custody of dependent children to women, that we did have a lot of men who were single parents. Now, if you look at the latest documents coming out of the Pentagon and the latest ideas, they will argue that the presence of gay and lesbians will undermine good order and discipline. There was a recent article in the Army Times within the last month in which the argument said, well, all these other ideas about security risks and all that, and there was a judge in a recent case where a midshipman from the Naval Academy by the name of Joe Steffen, who was booted out of the Corps about 10 days before graduation, and the judge called him a homo, and he said, if you let gay and lesbian people in the service, you'll have an outbreak of AIDS. Well, they've admitted a lot of that is not true, but they're falling back on the right of privacy, and that's sort of the latest rationale for it. And the argument would be that you would need separate living quarters and other accommodations which are incompatible with military service. Now, what I see happening out in society is a situation very similar to what happened with letting more married people in, integrating the service and letting more women in, is that society is ready for it. The opinion polls are very clear that society favors letting gay and lesbians into the military. The courts have begun to tell the military that you really need to justify your policy. We don't see very good grounds for what you're holding. And so everything is right for it to happen. The problem is that the civilian leadership, particularly in the Pentagon, is not willing to take it on because of their concern or their fear about the right wing. I mean, if you take a look at what's happening right now in the Pentagon, you've got a very forceful Secretary of Defense in Dick Cheney. And Dick Cheney has fired generals, canceled weapon systems, and won a war, but he refuses to get involved in this particular issue. And it's causing the great paradox of this is it's causing a lot of problems in the ranks, but not the good order and discipline. It's causing a lot of confusion. Most military people who I know, particularly the younger ones, would like to have a policy that focuses on behavior rather than orientation. As we were getting ready to go to war in the Gulf, there were all kinds of problems presented to the commanders. There were individuals who were being processed for discharges because they had admitted or were accused of being gay and lesbian. And then we were getting ready to go to war, so they were told, stop all administrative discharges, we'll take care of them when the war's over. So you had a situation in which you told somebody, well, we're going to put you out, but you'll have to wait till the war's over. And then paradoxically, you had people who were in the service who don't want to go into combat. They believed the recruiting ads when they signed up that, that you wouldn't get involved in combat. And they said, well, how do I get out of going to combat? Their buddy will say to them, well, you go down and say that you're gay or lesbian, and there's no societal stigma, and they've got to put you out. The commanders then were put in the position of saying, we don't believe you, but on the other hand, the policy says that if you say you are, you in fact are. And if you read the military journals, there's an awful lot of people expressing this. And let me leave you with this, and a lot of people don't realize this. When they look at this question, they forget that there are a lot of militaries around the world, and a lot of militaries allow homosexuals in. And let me give you two examples of countries that might surprise you. One is Spain, and the other is Israel. Both countries have very strong religious traditions. Thank you.
Hi, I brought all this up here and I can't read it while I'm talking, but it's my security blanket. I'm going to first tell you a little about who I am and where I come from and how I came to this incredible of all issues. I come from Marxist parents. My mother was Jewish, my father was black, Cuban, and Chinese. I grew up in a picket line, really, and grew up during the 50s and 60s. I was an anti-war activist. My father refused to go into the Second World War because of this country's racial policies and spent a year in jail. I came up through the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and anti-war movements. And so I was not exactly poised to take on this of all issues, to fight to get people in, when most of my life had been fighting to keep them out. I came to Lambda on December 2nd, 1988. By December 29th, my first civil case, I was suing the entire United States military. And I have such narrow shoulders, It was really frightening. I was scared. It was Stephen v. Cheney. It wasn't called that at the time because Cheney was not at that time. And this, in fact, is the case or the issue that will not die. For some reason, this will not die. What it comes down to for me is that as gays and lesbians, we are born into this society, citizens of this society. We have every right to participate in every institution in this society. This is our country. To hold us out, to bar us from the major institutions of this society, as has been done historically, to people who have been valued less, people of color, women, people who have less money, is not only a violation of equal protection as it's written in the Constitution, but it's a violation of everything this country, every promise this country has held out since its inception. I, as a citizen of this country, will not stand for that. It is my country and I am responsible. You shouldn't stand for it either. The fact is that what it does to people, when you consider who goes into the military, young people, people of color, people who need access to careers, to jobs, to a rite of passage, women, people who may not have other alternatives. When I was a criminal defense attorney in Philadelphia, not often, but sometimes, an alternative to going to jail for some young men was going into the military. So you're an 18-year-old and you're on your way to the military. It's your first time away from home. You don't know who you are. Like when you go to college, this is a time of experimentation, exploration, finding out who you are, living in yourself, making all kinds of arrangements and connections. This happens to people in the military too. They leave home, they go, and they make contacts. Possibilities open up that never occurred to them before. What happens when that famous 10% makes that connection and it dawns on them that they are gay, or that, it's like wisps of things. It's not even, it doesn't come in that way. There you are. You have very few alternatives. You can repress this and not even think a thought, let it rise to your consciousness or even to the part just below consciousness. You can decide to go out and have contacts, gay and lesbian contacts, and tell only a very, very few people and live in the kind of distorted fear that such a closed society engenders, waiting for the one person who doesn't like you, or who, an ex-lover, or someone who's tried to hit on you and you've rejected, to start rumors to tell on you. Or you can stand up and say, this is who I am, and have the full weight of the entire United States Army come down on your head. This happens to person after person after person. We hear of people like Greta Kammermeyer and Joseph Stephan and Perry Watkins and Miriam Ben-Shalom and Captain Judy Mead, because when you're in this business, or the business I used to be in, which was the business of trying to gain rights where there are no rights in courts, you need the most pristine kind of plaintiff, someone whose character and performance is stellar and unimpeachable. But the vast majority of us don't measure up to that. And so young lives are crushed in a variety of ways. People go to prison. Women go to prison for things like indecent acts, whatever that is. People lose the ability to function in a society after they get out of the military because, as in Captain Mead's case, if she were found to have been guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer because she associated with a known lesbian without telling her commanding officer, she would have lost 12 years of a career, all the benefits. She was an MP and not a lesbian. She would have been unable to find a job in civilian life. This is the cost that is done in our name. This cannot go on. It's as simple as that. We cannot allow this to go on. The military is a parallel society. It's called that in many court cases. It is the number one, up till this point, it's the number one employer of the United States. More people went through the military than went through any other institution in the society, with the possible exception of elementary school. So it is a question of what kind of country we want, what we will allow to be done in our name, and not just a question of the Constitution, but the Constitution gives us the basis and the vision and the promise with which to fight. That's why it's so beautiful. Because it says equal protection. This is a long fight. It is absolutely necessary to win this fight. Although we are winning in other contexts, we're getting more and more places. Jurisdictions are enacting civil rights, basic civil rights laws, including sexual orientation, anti-discrimination laws. 5 states so far have it. Now, you know what I sort of refer to when I think about this current stage, this movement, is the Hardwick decision. Because I think, like in Dred Scott, back in 1867, when the court said that black people had no rights that the white man was bound to respect, and in fact could not even come to court. When Plessy v. Ferguson, back in 1891, I think it was, said separate but equal. When Korematsu said this is not to inter the Japanese, is not racism. When Bradwell v. Illinois said that women belong at home by the hearth because that is what God had suited them for. The Supreme Court, these wise men, said that. It was the people who moved and said, no, this is not what the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments stand for. This is not what the Bill of Rights stand for. You've held out a promise of equity to us under the Constitution and in this country, of equitable citizenship, and we demand nothing less. So we will see Hardwick overturned by the people and eventually overturned by the court. Kansas, Texas, Kentucky have all overruled their sodomy statutes based on their own constitutions. So that's what I have to say. This is a struggle. This is one aspect of that struggle. it is an important aspect of that struggle. Because if we could get this law, if we could get this bar over, it would help in all the other ways, with child custody, with any number of other ways in which we are crimped and not allowed to be fully human in this society. But we're going to struggle, and we're going to win. Thank you.
I apologize for being late. It's 2 weeks in Massachusetts during the week is an unusual thing for us, and so we try to cram as much into it as possible. I will describe where we are and then how we get from there. You have just heard a very eloquent explication of why this ought to be changed. I know there are sometimes people who wonder why people who are on the left and anti-military, why they should be changed, and I think you just heard a very good explanation of it. I've tried to have a similarly succinct explanation for straight people who don't understand the importance of it. One of the things I've asked them is, if in fact there was no such rule, and I were to get up and say, look, I have this proposal, no gay man or lesbian ought ever have to put his or her life at risk for the country, I would be accused of seeking an outrageous preference. I mean, if I announced that of all the people in this country, we alone ought to be quit of the responsibility to defend it, I think people would think that this was a very poor thing to do. Having said that, I think we all ought to acknowledge that if in fact there was a draft, this would be a somewhat more controversial issue within the community. I do remember in 1958 when General Eisenhower ordered American forces into Lebanon. And apparently at the time they had sub rosa decided that Jewish soldiers would not be sent in. And some of the Jewish organizations complained about this exclusion. And several Jewish women suggested that they shut up. And having their sons excluded from going to Lebanon was not the worst thing that Dwight Eisenhower had done. But temporary advantage means very little compared to the obloquy that it carries with it. And there is a very important reason why, there are a couple of important reasons why we ought to be able to, why we should be focusing on this one now. One, it is the last official policy of the United States government that says gay men and lesbians are bad people. We had a worse one in terms of effect. We had the one in the immigration law that said if you were gay or lesbian, you couldn't come to America even as a tourist. It wasn't widely enforced, but it was on the books. That was extraordinarily obnoxious, and it was repealed in 1990 flat out. We now have this as the last policy. That doesn't mean there aren't anti-gay and lesbian things they do, but in most cases, they do them hypocritically. And hypocrisy is not totally to be rejected, as you know. Well, it's a good sign, because when you have gotten them to being hypocritical, they are at least acknowledging that you have got the right side of the argument. It's, I don't know, I'm at Harvard, it seems to me appropriate. La Rochefoucauld, hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. When you get people to be hypocritical, you've won one stage in the argument. The anti-gay and lesbian policy of the military is the last flat-out, you're no good, we want no part of your policy, and for that alone, we have an obligation to try and get rid of it. Now, there's one other reason to go after it. It's as shaky as it can be. I had some conversations with Secretary Cheney about this, and with General Powell, and with others. And as a result of those conversations, I got up on the floor of the House one day and said that I had long known that there were no good reasons for excluding gay men and lesbians from the military. I now know from discussing this that there are no bad reasons either. They have absolutely no reasons whatsoever. This is, in fact, a policy in search of a justification. The only reason we have it here, and Larry Corb told you, the only reason we have it is they haven't got the guts to get rid of it. I think some of them wish it was never there. They haven't got the guts to get rid of it. We are going to give them the courage of those convictions. And that is important because movements need victories. Sometimes people who are engaged in movements think that the way to get people motivated is to constantly bemoan our fate, to talk always about how terrible things are, And when a victory does happen, get it out of the way so you can get misery back on the agenda. Yes, to motivate people, you have to tell them that things are bad. But you also have to tell them, convince them that there's a possibility of improvement. And movements need both causes to be eradicated and some sign of victory, some showing that things can get better. And I think we can win this one. And we should because it is symbolic of a lot of things. Here's where we are. We have had the policy for some time, as you know. It has become weaker. One of the problems is that they cannot think of reasons to defend it. You just heard in the previous discussion, the Joe Steffen case. There was a judge named Oliver Gash who decided this against Joe Steffen. He is an incompetent fool. He is hearing this case, makes references to homos. A little side point here. I'm a chairman of a subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee, which has jurisdiction over the civil division of the Justice Department. And the Justice Department, to its discredit, opposed the motion to discredit this guy. He said on the bench, what? He knows a lot of homos? So is that your argument, that he's associated with a lot of homos? Steffen's lawyers correctly moved to disqualify the judge because that showed a kind of prejudice. I mean, if you were dealing with if it had been the case about the right of Orthodox Jews to wear yarmulkes, which the Army had said they couldn't do, and he had said, oh, what are you going to tell me? All the other Hebes agree with him? I think a disqualification would have been a fairly easy thing to do. And that's, of course, very much analogous. The Justice Department, to its discredit, opposed the motion to disqualify, and the judge was not disqualified. And I complained. I wrote to the head of the Civil Division. And he wrote back, and he talked to me, and he basically conceded I was right. And what I said was, you know, I don't want my government taking advantage of every little last bit like this. You're the Justice Department. Yeah, you've got a right to try to win the case. You don't have the right to try to benefit from this kind of bigotry. And I think we may have scored some points there for the next one. But this guy then went on, and he listened. And this is what's important, because Lawrence Corb mentioned that he decided that age was the reason for keeping this man out of the military. Even by the standards of a not very bright man, that was a very dumb thing to say. For one thing, no one with any sense thinks that AIDS is a gay-exclusive illness. Secondly, the military already has a very expensive policy of testing anybody who comes in. So, in fact, the only gay men who would be coming in would, in fact, have been tested positively. Finally, if you were going to use as the basis for exclusion that you're really worried about AIDS, you might decide that you want an armed force composed exclusively of lesbians, because they are, in fact, of all the people in our society, those who are least at risk for AIDS. They're not immune from it, but lesbians are statistically the least target group for AIDS. So if that was your reason, then you'd have a lot of lesbians in the Army, Navy, and Air Force. But why did this judge come up with such an implausible argument? Because there weren't any others. In fairness to this guy, he started with the obvious view that you can't allow all these homos to be polluting the military. And he was disappointed because the United States government didn't give him any reasons. And the important thing about his decision is not simply that he said AIDS was the reason, but he's the only person who said AIDS was the reason. The lawyers for the government didn't suggest it. Right. He pulled this one out of the air because he looked into what they had to say and he said, geez, they ain't got nothing. I better make something up for them. And that's what happened. You had this judge make something up. Now, he didn't do a very good job. And now if you ask them, I have asked Richard Cheney and Colin Powell why they want to keep gay men and lesbians out of the military, and they don't mention AIDS. And I think you've got an interesting grounds for appeal there, obviously, which is the judge made up a defense of a policy that was he took judicial notice. Nobody put anything into the record. It's just a very, very shoddy kind of decision. So then we get to the other arguments. Security had always been the one. Let's be very clear what happened to the security argument. We knew it was a nonsense argument, but they were using it. It was particularly bizarre if you were talking about people who were out, because the only security argument would be blackmail. Let me jump ahead to make one point in which I respect Colin Powell. He completely, when I asked him a few months ago about this, said the security argument doesn't hold, and he made it clear he was talking about that whether we were talking about people who were out or closeted. Because I asked him a question, he said, well, a lot of these people are still in the closet, but the security argument still didn't apply. So we have Colin Powell saying that there was nothing at all to the security argument. Why did they admit it? I'll tell you why they admitted it. It has to do with outing. And people may think that outing is a good thing or a bad thing. But there was an article about the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, Pete Williams, which said that he was gay. And a week later, Secretary Cheney was testifying before me. It was on the budget. And he came prepared to discuss the military budget. And he testified before me, and I asked him a question about the budget. And then I did what we know in technical parliamentary language as blindside him. Because I asked him about gay men and lesbians in the military. He was about as ready to be asked that as he was to get up and sing the first act of La Traviata. And I said, I have this question about the policy for excluding gay men and lesbians from the military. Is it based on security? I said, now I know that it only applies to people in uniform. Subtext, i.e., not your press secretary. But if the... I didn't say that, but he knew it, and I knew it, and he knew I knew it, and I knew he knew it, and everybody knew it. And this was in front of the TV cameras, and I said then, I understand this only applies to the military, but is the rationale for excluding gay men and lesbians from the military security? Dick Cheney is a very smart man, as Larry noted. He knew that if he said that security was the argument, it would have taken about a minute and a half for somebody else, not me, to say, well, what about your press secretary? Because even though the policy does not apply to him, the rationale would. Because clearly, who knows more secrets? Her or the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs? My guess is, no offense, that Pete Williams knew a few more secrets than you did during the Gulf War. And so if security is a problem, where's he come off? So Cheney said, well, as you know, Congressman, that policy only applies to people in uniform. Not my press secretary, unstated. But I don't think security is the argument. That, he said, is a bit of an old chestnut. He said, we just have it because, and he then went on to say that we had the policy because we had inherited it. And he then said 6 times in the next, 3 times to me and 3 times to Sam Donaldson the next Sunday, that we had inherited it. And that's all he would say. That is all he has ever said. Dick Cheney has simply appeared in this as the repository of a tradition about which he has nothing good to say, but he's not going to get rid of it. So that was the first step. Then we had Colin Powell. And then, by the way, he went on, and this is very important. He went on, and Sam Donaldson said to him, well, what about your press secretary? He said, let me tell you something. I'm not talking about individuals by name, but I'll tell you this. If someone works for me and he does his job, that's all I care about. And his sexual activity, he didn't say that. Whatever he does in his private life is irrelevant. I'll send it to you if you want it. But if you want a ringing defense of the irrelevance of sexual orientation to jobs, if you want a strong argument in favor of job protection of gay men and lesbians, I got it for you. It was Dick Cheney, and he said it on national television. And it's a very strong defense of the right that he has to hire anybody, including the most secret. I mean, I can't imagine that there are many secrets that they don't tell the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs. So that was the first step. Then we went on into some other areas trying to find out what the reason was. We got into the negatives. It's not AIDS. It's not security. We asked if it was a behavior problem. They're very clear about this. We all know that there have been hundreds of thousands over the years of gay men and lesbians in the military, perhaps millions, nobody knows. We know one thing. There is zero record of behavior problems except, well, there's no significant record of behavior problems. The only problem is that they said it's a problem, so they made it a problem. I mean, the only reason gay men and lesbians have been kicked out is because they were gay men and lesbians. But the behavior patterns have not been serious, and there has certainly been, I am sure, many more, and I'm willing to say per capita, problems involving heterosexual sex than homosexual sex in the military, partly because homosexual sex is under such constraints and heterosexual sex was not. So they don't have that argument. We do get down to the argument that you just heard. The guy who wrote that article is a man named Charles Moskos from Northwestern. And he was quoted in the Washington Post a while ago saying, well, the reason to keep them out is that you got to ask yourself, would you like to share living quarters with a homosexual? I wrote him and I said to him, well, let me ask you a question. How far does that go? How about gymnasiums? How about overnight camps? How about firefighters? I mean, there are a lot of places in this society where people of the same sex undress in front of each other, in locker rooms, in a whole lot of sleeping arrangements. Does that mean, the logic of that would be that you exclude homosexuals from everywhere? But he's become the great spokesperson. He has never answered me on that. He also said in that article, but yes, he did say that in that article, because he sent me a copy, that some people have tried to draw an analogy between racial segregation and the exclusion of gay men and lesbians, but he was sure that most black people would find that highly offensive. So, and the tone of the article made it clear that he thought that black people would be perfectly correct to find any such suggestion highly offensive. What he does with you, nobody knows. You have to work that out with him.
He doesn't talk to me at all.
Yeah, that's right. Well, but what you got was the Pentagon picking it up, because Colin Powell then appeared before us, and I asked Colin Powell. He was clearly ready for this. I asked him at the budget. He went further than Cheney. Let's be very explicit. Colin Powell said there is nothing to the security argument. Later on, I said to him, gee, you don't have behavioral problems. He said, I understand that, Congressman, but you're talking about people who were most of whom are in the closet. You put his argument together without any distortion, and what you have is Colin Powell saying there is zero security argument whether people are in or out of the closet. He then said the problem is that straight people would feel uncomfortable if they had to share living quarters with homosexuals. If, in fact, you took the second sentence of what he told me and you struck the word heterosexuals and wrote in white people, and then you struck the word homosexuals and wrote in black people, you would have identically the rationale used for segregation. Ari's right, it is that. And he said, look, these are good people. They behave themselves. They are wonderful, patriotic Americans. And I'll give him credit, because he is clearly a man uncomfortable with defending this kind of thing. What they're saying is there's no security argument, there's no behavior argument, there is no record in the history of any problem. It is simply that the majority doesn't like having them around, and therefore they have to be excluded. Part of that is the unfair and damaging notion that gay men and lesbians are such prisoners to their sexual drives that if you put them in proximity to other people, uncontrollable urges will overtake them and terrible things will happen. Joe Steffen, who was the plaintiff, said, hey, I've been undressing with straight men all my life. I've been in gym. I've been in... I mean, it just hasn't happened. Well, Powell's argument apparently is that, well, it hasn't happened because these people are closeted. But if it was acknowledged that they could be gay, they might then, what, make unfair approaches? It's just crazy. You get the real reductio ad absurdum of this in Judge Robert Bork, not surprisingly, who issued one of the most negative opinions here in the Dronenberg case, in which he went beyond, Bork went beyond the traditional judicial role. The traditional judicial role for conservative who believed the judicial conservatism, which I don't think Bork does. I think he was an enormous activist with an agenda. But you would say, hey, it's not up to us to say whether this is a good policy or not. Bork went beyond that. He said, of course you want to keep homosexuals out of the military, basically. And he said there are two reasons. First of all, they are disgusting. Secondly, they're irresistible. I mean, that was, in effect, what he said, because he said there were two reasons. First of all, straight people would find the presence of homosexuals so upsetting that they would get very angry. And next, there would be this problem of seduction. And you know, you're allowed to argue in the alternative if you're a lawyer. That is, if you are a lawyer, you are allowed to present two wholly opposite theories for deciding the case. No one has ever said that a judge could decide in the alternative. That is, take the two opposite theories and use both of them. So Bork did that. But the point I want to make is this. I have been in a lot of arguments in my life. I have never been in an argument in which I have felt so comfortable with my side and in which the other side has been so weak. And as Larry Corb said, you'd have to subpoena them to discuss it. They will not talk about it. You would think, now remember, these are people, and we're not talking now about the generals, but the political appointees. These are people who are not reluctant to talk about welfare. They're not reluctant to talk about race. They're not reluctant to talk about patriotism. If they see the issue as politically appealing, you can bet they'd be out there. If they thought that the public was with them and that people ought to be excluded, you'd hear a lot about it. They understand how unpopular their view is. The position that honest, hardworking people shouldn't be allowed to defend their country, they throw that out. Now, let me just wind up by saying there are two ways that we might get rid of this. One way, if the current administration, well, let me that's the long way. There's a short way. Every Democratic candidate for president this year pledged to get rid of it. And it's an executive order. It doesn't require a statute. The president elected in November could get rid of it like that. And so if a Democrat gets elected president in November, that's the end of this nonsense. It is, and they have all said this, and I will tell you that I asked Bill Clinton back in September when he came to Congress what he was going to do in a private meeting about gay and lesbian issues. And he said, well, I told a reporter yesterday I'd certainly get rid of that military thing, that ban. I don't think that makes any sense. If George Bush wins, I think what you will have is this. they will be looking for a way to let it die without getting blamed. The best way may be the Ninth Circuit case, because I have indications from as you know, the Ninth Circuit said that you couldn't just invoke your right as the government to say no to people. The Ninth Circuit said that you would have to show a good reason for kicking people out. And I have talked to people in the Justice Department. I think they don't think the Pentagon has a good reason. I think they fear that if they have to meet any standard of rational decision-making, they will lose. If they lose, then I think the time would be to step in at the circuit and say, okay, let's go to what Larry Corb said, a behavior standard. Let's then have a set of rules that say you cannot date someone whom you are directly commanding. You better not impose yourself on anybody else. Let's have a strict set of rules that apply that will protect a lot of women against unfair harassment from men. Let's have a whole strict set of rules that say, look, you're in an unusual situation in the military. We're not saying that gay men and lesbians in the military should be able to behave exactly as they would in private life, any more than heterosexuals can. The military imposes constraints. We could then have a set of very strict standards that would protect anybody in the military from being sexually imposed upon by anybody else. The main effect of that would be to retard sexual harassment by women, on the part of men of women, but it would also guarantee that there wouldn't be any problem either way. So that's where we are. Democrats win, it's over. We go on to the next fight. If the Republicans win, we will continue to carry it out, but we do so within the context of their knowing and our knowing that their case is a very weak one, and that ought to allow us to keep it at the top of our agenda. Thank you.
I should mention in the context of Congressman Frank's observation that this is not an issue that the Defense Department is anxious to discuss, that although I do not believe that every forum event ought to present every side of every issue. After all, we are going to have the chief of the Bush-Quayle re-election campaign here next week, and he is not being asked to share the podium with Ron Brown or Bill Clinton. Nevertheless, some large number of officials from the Department of Defense were invited let me use a little legalese. Some large number of officials from the Department of Defense, including but not limited to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, were invited to speak at this event tonight, and all of them refused. Having said that, I think in light of the time, I would like to go directly to questions from the audience, if there are questions from the audience. If you could approach one or the other microphone.
Right in the middle, either way.
And I have been asked by the organizers to remind people of the difference between statements and questions.
Good evening. My name is Roland Dumbreck. I'm a graduate student here and a member of the faculty-student committee that President Rudenstein has initiated to help determine what Harvard is going to do about its ROTC program. And one of the things we've been debating is whether Harvard's decision either to stay in ROTC, our students go to MIT, but we have a contract with the Navy, or whether we pull out and no longer allow them to have that contract, whether that will have any effect on either the Department of Defense, on Congress, on the executive branch, one way or the other. We may decide in the end that it doesn't matter, that we will make our decision based on our own beliefs of what Harvard should do. But I'd like to ask Congressman Frank and perhaps Dr. Corb if they have any comments.
As far as Congress is concerned, there's a cumulative impact. I say that because obviously rarely does one anything have an impact, but I think it helps. It's obviously a painful choice for people, but I think if there are any significant number of institutions, particularly institutions that command a lot of respect, that say you're asking us to be bigoted and we won't do it, yeah, that'll have an effect. That will be helpful, because part of what we want to do, part of it will be to help persuade people. And this one, frankly, this policy doesn't have very many defenders. There are people who are saying, gee, it's more trouble to change it than not. This kind of trouble, we can go to them and say, you know, do we really need this? Do we really need this kind of agitation and anguish? And I think that it helps them.
Well, I think probably in the long run it will, but I've been involved in this issue because several university presidents have come to me because they've been writing letters to the Pentagon and getting a reply from Captain so-and-so rather than from Dick Cheney or any of the assistant secretaries. And at the request of Donna Shalala, who's the president of the University of Wisconsin, I used whatever influence I might have left in the Pentagon to try and get in a meeting with the assistant secretary for force management and personnel. The meeting was totally unsatisfactory. What they were told is, look, we have more ROTCs than we need. If you guys want to go ahead. And that's why I say it's really got to be the civilian leadership in the short term. The great tragedy of this policy is that it's really hurting the country in the long run, because one of the reasons for ROTC is to ensure that the military officer corps has a wide cross-section of society. Once schools begin to give it up, you no longer have that cross-section from society, and a lot of other principles are brought into jeopardy in terms of democratic values and civilian control. But to be very frank, the answer is, in the short term, on the people in the Pentagon, none.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think in the Pentagon, no. In Congress, yes. And that's because what it does is create political turmoil, which we can use rather than disfigure or disable their military effort.
Yes.
My name is Eric Tsuchida. I'm a student at the law school here, and I noticed that Colonel Kammermeyer said that that administrative hearings to kick her out of the military were commenced after she disclosed that she was a lesbian through a top-secret security clearance interview, I guess. And I have a question about that. Let me just give a quick background on this question. Last semester, a couple of lawyers from the State Department came for a little brown bag luncheon, and they handed out little pamphlets talking about, they were from the Office of the Legal Advisor, and they said that they handed out these pamphlets about what a lawyer would do there. And I noticed that they didn't have an anti-discrimination clause in there, so I asked them, do you have an anti-discrimination clause? And she said, oh, we're the government. We uphold Title VII. We don't discriminate. We fight discrimination, so of course we don't have a discrimination clause. And so I said, okay, well, do you discriminate against gay people? And she said, well, we don't have a policy against it, but every person who becomes a lawyer at the State Department has to go through a top-secret security clearance check. And she said that might present a problem to gay people because one of the things they look for is stability. And I thought for a second, do they mean mental stability? And she said, oh, well, we mean, they don't have stable relationships. They look for stable relationships. And I thought that was even a worse answer. And I thought she was really stupid for saying anything like that, considering she's a lawyer especially. And so I asked the head of our Harvard Law School has a policy of not allowing people to recruit on campus who discriminate on the basis of lots of different things, including sexual orientation. And so I asked them to ask for a clarification from the State Department about their hiring policies. And after several months, we got a notice back saying that there is no discrimination against gay men or lesbians. I presume that included top-secret security clearances. And I was wondering if anyone could tell me, is there one agency that does all the top-secret security clearances? And if so, are there different standards? Do they, for the military, have a different standard for top-secret versus like a lawyer at the State Department?
I might direct that in order, first to Colonel Kammermeyer, also to address, if not the last question, did you know that this question was going to be asked before you had the interview? And then I suppose in terms of the last question, maybe Larry Corb should answer that. But
what I was told was that the Defense Investigative Service is a branch of the government that conducts investigations for the other armed forces. And so they were interviewing me as part of their role in investigating for security clearances. Any information that they obtain is then shared with the branch of service. And that's how the information that I discussed with them went to the Department of Army and then the National Guard and then down the ladder, up the ladder, went around. And I was not, well, at some level, I thought that the question might be asked, but I certainly had not prepared an answer. And when the time came in terms of responding, I just told them the way it was, because I was not going to lie, and I was not going to jeopardize the very thing that I was trying to represent, which was, you know, being the best that I could be.
Let me make a few comments here. It used to be that if a person was found or admitted to be gay or lesbian in a security clearance, that the person granting the clearance, remember, this is not a right, if you will, under law, it's a privilege. The person granting it gets your whole file and they make a judgment whether you can be trusted with this higher and higher degrees of sensitive information. It used to be that in many cases it was a bar to getting a security clearance. Interestingly enough, the man who changed that at the CIA was none other than George Bush. When he came in there as director and found out that people would be in the agency were being denied security clearances only on the fact that they were found out or admitted to be gay and lesbians, he said, no, that's not sufficient reason. In Colonel Kammeyer's case, it wasn't the security clearance that was a problem. She could have a security clearance, but when they found out that she admitted that she was a lesbian, the Army then said, we don't allow lesbians in, so you've got to get out. Now, if you're interested at all in this subject, let me talk about some data, because I think this is very important. As I was getting ready to leave the Pentagon, we had a whole bunch of security breaches. You had John Walker and Larry Wu Tai Chin and the fellow that the Israeli Pollard. And so we got a group together again. We said, well, what's wrong? I mean, we do thousands and thousands of hours in investigations, and these people have all been cleared. What's happening? So I got a group together to look and say, what is the security risk? Well, it takes a long time. By the time they finished, I had left, and they came up and they said, the biggest security risks are heterosexual males. And that study, when it came out, it's by the Defense Personnel Security Research and Education Center, they recommended that, by the way, you ought to take a look at your policy about, having gays and lesbians into the military. Up until Dick Cheney came out and said what he said to Congressman Frank, and on This Week with David Brinkley, many civilians in the Department of Defense were not given security clearances primarily on that basis.
Let me follow up briefly on that, because I think, first, it ought to be very clear. The official policy of the government, to answer your question, it's department by department who gives the security clearance. The FBI does the investigations for all the civilians, but it's each department decides. I have had conversations with the State Department about this. They have told me, Ivan Selin, who's now at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, when he was undersecretary, promised me that he, while he was undersecretary, would make sure that they followed the policy of not denying people security clearance. And basically what we're saying is sexual practices might be the basis for your losing a security clearance, but that's irrelevant to whether they were heterosexual or homosexual. If you were putting yourself in a compromising position with anybody, that would be the problem. So the answer is that her answers were out of sync with policy, and I would ask you later, give me some specifics, because I want to write to the State Department and say, this is an example of something that I trust you will see will never happen again. There is a kind of a cultural lag there, but the answer is, no, they assure us now, and I've got someone applying for a job with the FBI that I'm trying to help. Whether you are gay or straight is not supposed to be relevant at all. And to follow up just the last point on what Larry said, when we asked him, what's the major cause of people betraying America, the major cause was money. So if you're going to exclude anybody for security reasons, it'd probably be yuppies. But money is the major cause for people betraying the country.
Yes.
Yes, my name is Emil Michael. I'm president of the Harvard Republican Club. On campus, this debate has been roaring for the last couple of months, and many members of my club do agree that the policy should be taken down, and the Department of Defense is wrong. But the major problem that we're facing is the ROTC cadets, the ROTC cadets now, on campus. And what happens to them? They had no part in making the policy. What happens to them? They came to Harvard on the scholarship and probably wouldn't have been able to come without it. Now, I wondered if it's possible for Harvard to make a statement. Can Neil Rudenstein have a press conference? Can Neil Rudenstein have a press conference? Can the Faculty Council come out with a decision denouncing the policy without actually severing the ties, therefore saving the integrity and the diversity of the Harvard community? And if they cannot, if Harvard comes out saying that they must sever ties with the ROTC program for students, doesn't it follow that they should sever their ties with the defense grants that they get from the Department of Defense as well? Because I guess that would follow in the whole sense. And I want to know, as a congressman, would that have as great an effect? Can Neil Rudenstein do that? Can the Faculty Council do that? And would that make a difference?
Well, certainly a strong statement of condemnation would be helpful. And yes, I believe within the, I'm not an expert in the governance of Harvard, but I would think that the president and the fellows and the faculty in combination or separately could make such a statement. Let me just address a couple of the other points you made, though. One, I think you make a very strong point about keeping faith with people who are here. And I would not favor cutting anybody off who had entered on a certain basis. It seems to me that people have a right to a reliance on the terms in which they entered, and nobody ought to be cut out midstream. People should understand that this denial is a problem. It's what gay men and lesbians face, and the purpose of this is not to punish ROTC, obviously, but to try and persuade them to change. But no, I would not change the policy midstream. Finally, I don't think the analogy, the only point on which I disagree with you there is the analogy, and I know Christine Carnesal has been very gracious with his time in talking to some of us about this, and we talked about the same issue. There is a difference between participation in ROTC and in the defense grant program and taking money from the Defense Department to do studies, and it's this. Let's put it this way. If the Defense Department announced that it was looking for people to do studies of a certain thing, but no gay or lesbian faculty members need apply, then you would have a good analogy. In other words, what Harvard is doing here is not simply talking about disapproval of a policy. When you go into the ROTC policy, or when you have military recruiters, what you are saying is, look, to our students, you who are in the majority are eligible for this program, and you, the minority, the gay and lesbian students, we have to keep you out. Now, that's not the case with programs from the Defense Department, because when the Defense Department puts out research grant money, it doesn't discriminate. So there is a difference here, because in the one case, the university is being asked to participate in the discrimination. In the other, we're not saying, I'm not saying that because the Defense Department discriminates, people should not cooperate with it under any way, shape, or form. I think it is a step further to say, I regret the fact that you discriminate. I'm going to try and change it. And by the way, I will not participate in those aspects of your policy which are discriminatory. So I think there's that distinction.
I think the problem you can run into is the opposite problem. The Defense Department can be vindictive if they want and punish these poor people, you know, who get
Really?
and so I think, you know, that you're right to be concerned about any group of people that get affected by a change. And the other is they can be vindictive with the research grants. There was a fellow who worked in the Pentagon when I was there. His name was Don Hicks. He was Undersecretary for Research and Engineering. He said these campuses have the right to say what they want about SDI, which was the big issue, the Strategic Defense Initiative. I have the right to give my money where I want. You know, I mean, so rather than the problem you talked about, there could be the other side of the problem.
Can I just explain that Dr. Corb was, after leaving the Pentagon, a very courageous and thoughtful critic of some aspects of American defense policy unrelated to this, and the Pentagon retaliated by working to get him fired from his company. So that's my reference to their being vindictive. You were asking the man who owns one.
Dr. Schauer, as an officer with 18 years experience in the Coast Guard, which is incidentally under the Department of Transportation, not the Department of the Treasury.
I'm sorry.
It's only been about 25 years. I would like to say that I'm disappointed that we didn't have the other side in the panel, because there is at least one person here tonight that does support the policy that the military has, and I believe there might be more than one. However, that being said, if the policy was to be changed, I'm sure that it could be worked out. And my question is for Mr. Frank. Why doesn't Congress pass a law, and it really doesn't require a separate law, just a single line item in the DOT or DOD appropriation or authorization bills, and if that's done, that in fact will be implemented. But I believe
because we don't have a majority of both houses ready to vote for it.
I think that indicates the sentiment of the country regarding the issue at this time.
Well, it may or may not, but I have to tell you that having said that, I'm not sure what you've said. If you want to say to me that, because I think if I had a poll of my colleagues, in fact, let me quote one, Newt Gingrich, the minority whip, who was asked by Andrew Sullivan of the New Republic, what do you think about this policy of excluding gay men and lesbians from the military? And he said, I have no strong opinion on that. Sullivan said, okay, give us your weak opinion. And he said, all right, I think it's wrong. So I said, I'm glad to see you think it's wrong. What are you going to do about it? He said, oh, we can't do anything about it before the election. It's a fear of controversy. Yeah, if you're making the point that some of my colleagues are worried about the electoral consequences, that's the case. But I hope you don't think that's a statement on the merits. Yeah, I think a large number of members of Congress would like to get rid of the policy. Some would like to keep it. And a lot, frankly, take the position that some of my colleagues will take from time to time. Keep that controversial issue away from me. Yes, you do have that view of Congress that they don't want to deal with that kind of a controversial issue. But you say that's the opinion of the country. The polls that I have seen, which I believe in this case, say that most people don't think that it's right to exclude people. On the other hand, polls don't always tell you exactly how people will vote politically. But in either case, it seemed to me to be the major factor. It seems to me the major factor ought to be the merits of the policy.
Last question.
Oh, I had two. Do I have to choose between them then, if they're short?
You could combine them, or two. But.
Okay. My name is Michelle Beneke. I'm a law school student. I also was an active duty Army officer for 6 years prior to law school. My first question is for Congressman Frank. I know that at one point the GAO was investigating the policy in an effort to find out how many taxpayers' dollars were being spent, or how much the policy cost taxpayers. And when I was lobbying in D.C. last summer, people had anticipated that the report was going to come out this fall, mentioning some sort of cost figure of the policy to the American taxpayer. I was wondering, had that report been released, and if so, what
I don't know, and I wouldn't put too much stock in it. In the first place, by Pentagon standards, we're not going to be talking about a lot of money, and you got to resist the temptation in a debate to use arguments that you really don't mean. And I think we are talking about a certain amount of money here that, look, nobody here is against that policy because of the money. Nobody really thinks anybody else will be against it because of the money. And if, in fact, somebody proved that it was going to cost us more to do it than to not do it, it still wouldn't change it. So I don't think that's a very strong read to rely on, and I don't think the GAO is going to do very much. And I think they're going to say, gee, we really couldn't tell much what was happening.
Okay. My second question was this. In addition to individuals coming out in the military, often the military initiates what are called witch hunts, pressuring especially young service members to name other people who might be gay, especially officers and senior non-commissioned officers. That is what is going on in Japan right now on the U.S. Independence and Blue Ridge, where 40 people are being discharged, 2 have been court-martialed, and 1 has been placed in jail. My question is whether or not any congressional response, or if anybody else knows of any other type of response, may have been lodged with the DOD in protest of this.
Yeah, there have been some protests, but the problem you have, and by the way, I think that one of the good effects of Cheney particularly denigrating the policy was that some of these people were being a little less eager. You have this problem with the military. Many of you know it better than I. It's a hierarchy. There is a great tendency for people to respond to what they think the superiors want. We have been able to slow that down in some cases. The most outrageous case we have was in Gay Pride Day in Washington last year, when a captain was marching on his next to the last day in the Air Force, and it was in the Washington Post that morning, and some fool in the Air Force decided that he had nothing better to do than to interrogate this guy, delay his release, and try and get him to talk about all these other gay men and lesbians. It was Monday night when his lawyer, well, his advocate, it wasn't a lawyer, called me. I talked to a couple of congressmen the next morning, including, by the way, Nick Mavoulis from the North Shore here, who's high up on the Armed Services Committee, and a couple of them called the Secretary of the Air Force and basically said, aren't you a lucky person? You have nothing better to do in the world than to stir up trouble by going into something as stupid as this. And they got the guy out very quickly. And what we hoped was that we would send the message that even if they didn't have the guts to get rid of this policy, they would at least not turn the fanatics loose in making people's lives miserable. But you have this problem. It's on the books. And you can get a homophobic admiral, you can get a homophobic captain or colonel somewhere, and if he or she takes it into his or her head to do it, it's very hard to stop them because they say it's on the books. So yes, we will try and intervene with that, but until George Bush is willing to change the policy or somebody else becomes president and changes it, there's no guarantee that innocent people won't have their lives ruined by that kind of homophobia, because we can yell about it and try and restrain it, but we can't stop it.
As we reflect not only upon the substance of what we've talked about, but on some of the questions, some of the responses, and the fact that a wide array of different institutions are represented here, I'd leave you to think about the distinction between can't and won't, and the distinction between what policies or programs or whatever are impossible as opposed to what policies and programs, for a wide variety of reasons, officials or other actors who actually have choices for one reason or another exercise in one direction or another. I'd like to thank the panel very much, and I hope you'll join me in thanking them.